All right, so in today's lesson, we are going to continue our work with fractions, and we are going to be looking to find common denominators. And so when we talk about common denominators, when we look at common and we talk about common really means same. So we're looking for denominators that are going to be the same. And really, where you're going to want to go with this by the end of the lesson is you're going to want to be looking for what's called the least common denominator. And so in this case, least is going to mean smallest. So I'm looking for the smallest same denominator that two fractions can be turned into equivalent fractions. So the problem that you guys are going to look at is with Sue and Dina and wanting to have a fraction of cornbread. So Sue wants half of a rectangular pan of cornbread because I guess she's pretty hungry, especially if it's really good cornbread, whereas Dina wants a third of a pan of cornbread. And so that's what my two images represent there. Sue's represents half of the pan that she wants. Dina's represents a third of the pan that she wants. So the question that we have that we are going to be looking for is it's going to be looking for how could I cut one pan of cornbread, because they have to share. How could I cut one pan of cornbread so that they each get the size portion that they want? So when we look at this, we're really looking at common denominators. So Sue right now, if you look at the part that she has shaded in, she has 1 out of 2 pieces shaded in. Dina has 1 out of 3 pieces shaded in. So really what we're looking for is we're going to look for a common denominator for halves and thirds. And to do this, we're looking at multiples. So we're looking at multiples of 2 and 3. So I may need to, if I'm not sure what the value, a common denominator, I can do for 2 and 3, I'm going to list out my multiples. So my multiples for 2 are going to be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And I'm just going to list out the first few. I'm not going to list all of them out because we know that multiples go on infinitely, but I'm just going to see if I can't find that common value. I'm going to do the same thing for 3. So I have 3, 6, 9, 12, and I'm just going to stop there. And then I look for the values that are going to be the same. So the value that I have that's going to be the same is going to be 6. So really what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a piece, or I'm looking for a pan of cornbread that I can cut into 6. So what I can do is I can take Gina's idea of thirds and I can cut the cornbread into thirds, but then I can take Sue's half that she wants and cut them into a half. And so what'll end up happening is Sue will get a half of cornbread. So she will get the half that she wants. So she gets this half. And then Dina will get a third of the cornbread. And so Dina will end up getting this amount. And so what we're left with is Sue ends up getting 3/6 of cornbread, whereas Dina gets 2/6 of cornbread. And so the total amount of cornbread that was eaten in the pan was 5/6, which means that I have 1/6 left over that was not eaten in that pan of cornbread. Okay, so let's take a look at your visual learning on the next page. So I'm on page 378. When I take a look at the visual learning, the problem says Tyrone partitioned a rectangle into thirds. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw my thirds the way that it shows in the book. So I'm going to draw my thirds. Fractions are a great way for visuals. Visuals really help you see why values are the way that they are. All you really have to do is just kind of make sure that your squares are in the same size and then cut them as best approximately as you can. Sally partitioned a rectangle of the same size. So notice the keyword there was same size. So I'm going to try and draw it about the same. It's pretty close to the same, into fourths. And so they did fourths where the fourths were going that way. Okay. And then it says, how could you partition a rectangle of the same size to see both thirds and fourths. So what we're looking at is I'm looking at if I have a third or a fourth here, that's 1/4. And then if I have a third here, that's going to be 1/3. I'm looking for a common denominator of 3 and of 4. And so by looking for a common denominator of 3 and 4, I really want to start looking for the least or the smallest. Remember that smallest common denominator that 3 and 4 can go into. So if you need to list out your multiples, list out your multiples. So again, we have 3, 6, 9, 12. And then for 4, I have 4, 8, 12, 16. And you'll notice the value that I have in common, that's the smallest value, is going to be 12. So my least common denominator is going to be 12. So what I would do is I would build a rectangle that had my thirds and then would also have my fourths. And now I have 12ths. So my 1/3, I would multiply my 1/3 times 4. And when I multiply using fractions, we talked about this a little bit yesterday with our division work, that whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do the numerator. I have to keep it balanced. So whatever I do to one side, so in this case, the side is down, I have to do the same thing to the top. So whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do the numerator. Well, to get to 12, I multiplied 3 times 4, and I got 12. So that means I end up with 1 times 4, which is going to be 4. And then when I look at my 1/4, to get to 1/4, to get to 12, I multiplied by 3. So because I multiplied 4 times 3, I have to multiply 1 times 3. So 1 times 3 is going to be 3. So my equivalent fractions, so 1/3 is going to be equivalent to 4/12, and 1/4 is going to be equivalent to 3/12. That convinced me, where it says draw a rectangle such as the ones above to find fractions equivalent to 2/5 and 1/3. It's a really big 1/3 that have the same denominator. So when I take a look at 2/5 and 1/3, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to find that least common denominator. So when I look at that, I'm going to say, okay, 3 times 5, and I don't always want to multiply, but I know that 3 times 5 is going to be my least common denominator because they are both prime numbers. They don't have any other factors. So my common denominator is going to be 15ths. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a square that has 15ths. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw my thirds. And then I'm going to draw my fraction that has fifths. And so just one thing to remember, that when you're doing this, you're always going to have one line less. So if you'll notice right there, I have my thirds. I have fourths because I drew 3 lines. And when I draw fifths, I now have, or 4 lines, I now have fifths. And so there's my 15. And so if I have 2/5 shaded, or 2/5 shaded in on there, I want to know how many 15ths that's going to be equal to. So I got that by multiplying by 3. So it's going to be 6/15. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shade in 6/15. And then my 1/3, I got that by multiplying. To get to 15, I multiply by 5. So whatever I do at the bottom, I have to do the top. So I end up with 5/15. So my 1/3 is going to be 5/15. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's my 5/15. Woo. Crazy. All right. So go ahead and move into your guided practice. And when we take a look at your guided practice, you are going to, says in the example on the previous page, how many 12ths in each section? Oh, we already did that. So we said when we did that, that 1/3 was going to be equal to 4/12, and 1/4 was going to be equal to 3/12. Okay, number 2. It says find a common denominator for each pair of fractions. We're really going to be looking for the least common denominator, or the smallest value that can go into there. So if I have 3/8 and 2/3, I can list out my multiples. So if I did 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, I'm going to go a little bit bigger because I know 8's a larger number. So 18, 21, 24, 27. And then I'll list out my multiples of 8. So I have 8, 16, 24, 32. The values that I have in common is 24. So 24 is my least common denominator. You do not have to list out multiples. If you can look at that and go, oh, it's 24 is the smallest value, great. You do not need to list out multiples. This right here, remember we talked about that scaffolding. This is that scaffolding. If you need to do this to help you find the least common denominator, do the scaffolding. So then I'm going to multiply. So for now, I'd like for you guys to show the values that you multiplied. Again, it's that scaffolding piece, just so I can see what you're doing. You're modeling that math for me, and then we'll get to a point where you no longer need to show me that multiplication. So 3/8 to get to 24, I multiply 8 times 3. So if you're not sure how many times 8 I multiply 8 by, you just count 1, 2, 3. And so whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. So now it's going to be 3 times 3, which is going to be 9/24. Okay. 2/3, same thing. I'm going to multiply this to get to 24. And 3 times 8 is going to be equal to 24. And whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do the numerator. So I'm going to multiply 2 times 8, and I'm going to get 16. So there are my equivalent fractions for 3/8 and 2/3 that share the common denominator. Gosh, I hate when that thing does that. So those are my common denominators. All right, the next one that we're going to take a look at is going to be 1/6 and 4/3. So again, you're shooting for the smallest that you can do. Yes, you can multiply and you could do 3 times 6 and that would give you 18, but it's not the smallest because 3 is a factor of 6. I can multiply 3 times 2 to get 6. So 1/6, I'm actually not going to change. It's going to stay as 1/6. 4/3, I need to do some work with 4/3. So 4/3, I'm going to multiply by 2 because 3 times 2 is going to be equal to 6. And then again, whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. So I'm going to multiply 4 times 2 and I get 8/6. So my common or my equivalent fractions that have the same denominators are going to be 1/6 and 8/6. In practice, I'd like for you guys to do 4 through 10 even, just like the examples that we did for 2 and 3, where I found the common denominator. Again, try to find the least common denominator, and then rewrite equivalent fractions with that new denominator. And then I'd like for you on your math practices and problem solvings to do problems 12, 13, 16, and 17.